Hello and welcome to the AVForums podcast extra for the 13th of June. The normal podcast will be back with you next week, next Monday, the 20th of June. But in the meantime, Steve, we've got another interview.
Our next guest is Stephen Auld from Dolby, who is going to be talking about all things Dolby Vision. And Phil, we started off by you reminding him you'd actually met him and interviewed him about Dolby Vision back at the Bristol show in 2008.
Indeed, I remember it. I wonder if you're going to mention this. Yeah, that's right. I remember vividly. I think it was the first demonstration of that technology in Europe, if I remember rightly. And yeah, I had the honour of going down there and showing it off and chatting to a bunch of folk in the AV press. So yeah, it was great.
So I mean, that was 8 years ago. We're now at the stage now where Dolby Vision is a far better known technology name. But exactly what is Dolby Vision?
Yeah, so yeah, you're right. I mean, in terms of our work in the field of imaging, it has been going on for quite some time, as you noted. So, bringing the high dynamic range experience to market, something we've been working on for a number of years. Dolby Vision itself, this is a way that we deliver much more dramatic imaging than has been possible before, with existing television technology. So specifically, we're able to deliver much brighter images with wider contrast, and not only that, we combine this kind of high dynamic range technology with wide color gamut. So been able to provide a much wider color palette to the viewer than we've been able to before, with much more saturated colors and much more vividness in terms of the image. So overall, it's just a really sort of compelling, much more dramatic image that we're able to deliver with Dolby Vision, utilizing high dynamic range and wide color gamut.
So how come we can have this technology now and not 8 years ago when you were first touting it? I mean, why is now the right time for this technology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, much like with most of Dolby's approach to bringing technologies to market, we work completely through an entire content chain. So as much as making sure that we're adapting the capabilities of the display technology, which is something that has really come on leaps and bounds over those past few years, we also need to make sure that we're working right the way up the other end of the chain. So working with camera manufacturers to make sure they can really capture these wider color spaces and wider dynamics, and then through that flow as this content then becomes graded and mastered and coded, and making sure there's a way to get it into the display. So what does that mean in terms of discs, in terms of streaming, in terms of broadcast? So it's quite a complicated content chain that you need to work within and make sure that you're enabling with products and services and expertise and all the rest of it to ultimately be able to deliver these better images to people's televisions.
When it comes to high dynamic range, along with Dolby Vision, there's also an open source version called HDR10. How does Dolby Vision differ from HDR10?
Yeah, so I mean, you can almost think of Dolby Vision as having this high dynamic range technology at its heart. And in fact, one of the things that you may have come across is the SMPTE standard of PQ, so 2084. Which is at the heart of both, more generic HDR solutions as well as Dolby Vision. Now, one of the things that's very different in terms of our approach in bringing HDR technologies to market is we've designed the entire Dolby Vision ecosystem to be much more future-proof. So I think if we look at generic HDR approaches today, there are a lot of limitations in terms of how that can be evolved over time. So with our approach with Dolby Vision, we've made sure that we're able to make full use of a 12-bit space for the image as opposed to 10 bits. We also utilize a higher capability in terms of the peak brightness. So you may have heard Dolby Vision supporting up to a 10,000 nit container. Which again is something that isn't really capable with other more generic solutions out there. And yeah, one of the key differences, and I'm sure we'll go into this a bit later, is around what we do with dynamic metadata. So one of the key differences is utilizing this frame by frame and scene by scene data that describes what's going on in every pixel, in every scene, within a Dolby Vision encoded piece of content. And that's really important, because what that means is that we can utilize all of that information within the display, the Dolby Vision enabled display, to deliver the best possible image depending on the optical characteristics of that display. And all of this together really says that we're able to deliver a more reliable, consistent image on televisions today, but at the same time building that pipeline so that it's much more future-proof for delivering even more compelling high dynamic range images into the future.
Stephen, we've seen some pretty misleading articles out there on the internet, which is that happens on the internet from time to time. These things do happen, but there's a lot of confusion and a lot of commentators saying there's going to be some kind of format war when it comes to HDR. Now, can we put this one to bed? Because that is not going to happen, is it? Because HDR10 and Dolby Vision, well, Dolby Vision is an option on top of HDR10, isn't it? So you're not really a rival. You're more of an add-on to that.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I mean, from our side, I think there are a number of parts to look at in terms of the format itself of Dolby Vision. So if you look at, let's say, playback and a Dolby Vision enabled display, we've made sure that Dolby Vision enabled displays are able to ingest and deliver the best possible quality of image of all different HDR formats. Partly that is because at the heart, like you mentioned, Dolby Vision, is based on this PQ standard, and we're able to ingest, more generic HDR formats, whether that's stuff for streaming or Ultra HD Blu-ray, and display that on a Dolby Vision display. So we always make sure that a Dolby Vision capable display is able to handle all these different formats. When we look at the content itself, or in terms of the bit stream, if you like, that's being sent into these displays, then we've designed Dolby Vision to be very, very flexible, but with compatibility at the heart. So we offer content distribution partners the ability to encode their content in a number of different ways, a number of different profiles, such that the Dolby Vision content is compatible, both with existing SDR displays, existing HDR displays, as well as Dolby Vision displays. So, we've made sure that Dolby Vision, from this, sort of end-to-end perspective, is compatible. And will deliver, the best possible quality of image, regardless of, the flavor, if you like, of high dynamic range that's coming into the display. But from a consumer perspective, the important thing is that, investing in equipment, having a Dolby Vision capable display, and that out there now, is something that really is what would you say, a good sort of future-proofing option to make sure that you're able to ingest not just that Dolby Vision content, but other sort of more generic high dynamic range content, or SDR for that matter.
So just to put it to bed, there is no format war, is there? There's just different flavors.
Yeah, I would say there's no format war. No, I think we need to remember that in terms of Dolby Vision content or high dynamic range content, a lot of this is going to be about availability, not just of display technology and those displays that are capable of various flavors, but we also need to make sure that the content is there. And what Dolby have been doing, and we've done this for umpteen years in audio as well, is working with content creators. So making sure that there's plenty of good quality content from major content creators in Dolby Vision, to be played back, not just on legacy displays, but also making sure you're able to deliver that much more compelling image on a Dolby Vision display. So no, I wouldn't say so. The other thing that is worth mentioning, because we didn't quite touch on this in terms of the differences, if you like, between HDR or generic HDR and Dolby Vision. We part of Dolby's IP relates to this PQ electro-optic transfer function, and that's something that is actually, what HDR10 is based on in any case. So in a way, that's that maybe sort of helps to put to bed this concept of a format war.
You mentioned Dolby enabled displays, and in reality, there aren't very many available yet in the UK. So what would actually happen if someone watches Dolby Vision content on a display that uses HDR10?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly when we look at the UK, the Dolby Vision enabled displays are coming now, thankfully, with our partnership with LG. So that was announced in January at CES show, but they're now in stores and starting to ship. So both the OLED 4K displays and the Super UHD displays. However, when it comes to watching content and Dolby Vision content on a non-Dolby Vision display, again, we've designed that system such that you're able to still watch the content if it's been encoded in what we call this backwards compatible way. Then there's always at least an SDR version in the base layer of that video bitstream that you can watch on your television. So we make sure there's always something that you can watch. But what we would say is that if you want to get the most out of that Dolby Vision content, watch it on a Dolby Vision enabled display, such as those that are coming to market in the UK from LG.
But if you had an HDR capable display, in other words, a display that supports HDR10, you would still get an HDR experience from Dolby Vision content.
So it really does depend on how the content creators are creating the content. We do make it very flexible for them to decide on what kind of flavor of bitstream they want to put together. So we do offer this what we call a backwards compatible mode, and there's different ways that you can contain this compatible base layer. So it could be compatible with SDR or HDR, it could be HD or Ultra HD. So it's a very sort of flexible approach, and it really depends. Each use case or application is going to be different. Each content distributor is going to have a different approach to how they handle assets and determine what flavor of stream to send to what device. But ultimately, yes, we make sure that there's that compatibility is part of this proposition, and we make sure that there's always at least this SDR base layer. But there are other profiles that can be used when you're encoding content.
Stephen, another area that really, with HDR, confuses the end consumer and confuses a lot of our listeners as well is the terminology of nits in terms of brightness. Obviously, up until now, we've always used Candelas meter squared, but it's virtually the same thing, nits and that. So we use that in our reviews. But when it comes to peak nits, there's lots of talk about 1,000 nits, 4,000 nits, 10,000 nits, and your standard is 10,000 nits, but we're struggling to get displays that reach 4,000 at the minute. So why have you specified 10,000? Is that to future-proof the technology?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what you see is that display capabilities are evolving and evolving quite rapidly. You're right. At the moment, something like a 4,000 nit display is pretty much at the top of what's available currently, with the current technology. But we see, improvements are always happening. Improvements in the display technology. I mean, just going back to when we met at the Bristol Hi-Fi show in, I think it was 2008. The technologies come on leaps and bounds. So we do want to make sure that we're able to eventually achieve that full 10,000 nit capability. But ultimately, our approach and the approach that we take with content creators is to make sure that when you're mastering content, you're mastering in the highest possible, what we call color volume. So the color space plus, the brightness that you can achieve across all these colors, including up to the peak white, that you're mastering in as wide a color volume as you possibly can. So make use of the maximum capabilities of displays today, but ultimately have that underlying pipe or that container for the content that's capable of delivering, up to this 10,000 nit capability.
It's interesting you mention that, because looking at films that were made 30, 40 years ago, depending on which cameras they were shot on, they actually have the latitude available to be released as HDR titles because the latitude existed at the time that those films were shot. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, what we've seen is that the capability to capture more of the image from cameras has actually existed for quite some time. And what's happened is that reduction in the dynamic range capabilities or the color space is done later on. So, when you're actually grading the content. So yeah, absolutely, it's entirely feasible to go back to the original masters, the film, and do a regrade in Dolby Vision. So, rather than take that graded, typically SDR grade, and then try and upscale it somehow, you can go back to the original master and rescan the film, do a new regrade, in Dolby Vision, and deliver a much better, richer version of that content than would have been available in the original SDR grade.
I guess before Steve comes in with the next question, I guess the follow-on to that has to be, though, will that be director approved? You are changing the content, as it were.
Yeah, that is a good question. To be honest, I think that's probably more a question for the studios themselves. My guess would be that there would be different approaches depending on each studio in terms of what level of approvals each bit of content would require, and bringing in the original directors. Fundamentally for us, everything about what we do for audio and imaging is about ensuring that director's intent is reproduced faithfully on the end device. So although maybe technically it could be possible to do some of this stuff without that, it's very much our approach to say, make sure that the original intent of the director, when they're creating this piece of content, is preserved throughout that content distribution chain for display. So this is just about saying, if you're going to be able to do a regrade of a film that was already shot, then how can we use this technology, Dolby Vision, and the wider dynamics and the wider color space to actually do a better job of achieving what that director was originally intending. But when it comes to the individual approvals, I imagine each studio will have their own approaches there.
In terms of the Dolby Vision content that's been created to date, what have you used in terms of peak nits and color space?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, we just talked about this before, that, the idea of Dolby Vision as a format is having this, real future-proofing capability for imaging. So we look at what the existing capabilities of displays are today. Again, every application is going to be slightly different. We have, Dolby Vision content now available in cinema through the Dolby Cinema proposition, as well as on streaming services directly into people's homes. We have our own professional reference monitor and a 4K 4,000 nit reference monitor that we use with various studios. So again, the approach here is master the content, grade the content in the widest possible color volume that you possibly can. So if you're able to use a 4,000 nit display with, say, a DCI P3 color space, then do that. That's great. So ultimately what happens is that the wider volume that you master and grade in will then be mapped to the particular capabilities of the displays. So if those displays are able to meet a certain percentage of P3 or Rec 2020, if they're not quite 4,000 nits, then the Dolby Vision display mapping technology in the display will take this larger color volume that it's been mastered in and then map it according to the capabilities of that display. But yeah, so something typically around 4,000 nits and the P3 color space is what we'd see today, but that's not necessarily how things will evolve.
your ultimate goal then is what, 12-bit, 10,000 nits and Rec 2020?
Pretty much, yeah. That's that's the at the heart the capabilities that we're building into Dolby Vision. So again, as these ecosystems evolve, the display technology evolves, the reference monitor capabilities evolve, then the format is there, sort of ready to deliver, to deliver that.
I guess another thing that confuses people when it comes to nits and brightness, and I think we need to get this explained as best as possible. What we're talking about is not the whole screen being 4,000 or 10,000 nits and brightness. All we're talking about is specular highlights and highlights to various areas of the image and very small areas of the image.
Exactly right. Yeah. I think that there can be some misconceptions that, high dynamic range is all about, blinding brightness, and that simply isn't the case. Having that ability to, yes, deliver brighter images, that is true. This is something that is used to great effect in pulling out highlights from an image. And typically those highlights will only be in, a certain percentage of the screen at any one time. And that really gives that realistic sense of looking at nature, really. So when you have reflections in water, or reflections off say metallic surfaces, or something like this, you're just getting a much more realistic image. But the other angle to that, so yes, being able to deliver brighter whites and brighter colors is definitely part of that experience. But the other thing is being able to pull out details in the dark. So this whole wide dynamic range that we can offer in this wider contrast ratio is also about delivering a more realistic, better quality reproduction of details that reside in the darker parts of the image, and at the same time has been able to show these brighter highlights, the specular detail in the image. So yes, that is a very valid point. A lot of this is trying to capture a more realistic, much more detailed image, rather than just super bright images.
You mentioned earlier, Stephen, that Dolby Vision is an end-to-end solution. Can you just explain this end-to-end process in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so as you might imagine, with Dolby's approach, we really want to make sure that we're able to deliver what the content creator intended. That's something that we bring to all of our technologies and formats that we bring to market. And really, we can only do that if we work right at the beginning. So when that content is being created, that's the first step. We need to know, okay, what are you trying to achieve with this content, both sonically and also with the image. So when we're talking about this end-to-end approach, we really need to make sure that we understand the kind of tools and the workflows that content creators are using, so that when it comes to carrying that intent and displaying it on consumer equipment, or in the cinema even, that we're doing that faithfully and doing it consistently. So that starts with working with as we sort of alluded to earlier, camera manufacturers. So ultimately, you have to acquire the image somehow through the camera, and we've done an awful lot of work with camera manufacturers to make sure that they're able to capture the best possible quality image, and that's able to be utilized within this Dolby Vision high dynamic range and wide color space. As well as that, we need to make sure that there are displays. So we sort of talked about this earlier. You may be familiar with our professional reference monitors. These are tools that we build to enable content creators to actually look at the content and make these creative decisions about how they want each scene to look, before that's then ultimately graded and encoded and played back. So we have to work within these workflows for both grading and mastering content. And as much as there are certain things we do ourselves there, a lot of it is working with partners. So companies that were already there in the industry that provide all of these tools to the content creators, the production, post-production communities, to make sure that they're enabled and can handle the Dolby Vision content. And then as we sort of work our way through that chain, We work with video encoder manufacturers to make sure that the video can be encoded in Dolby Vision, that nothing is lost, that all of this nice dynamic metadata is able to be embedded within the video bit stream. And then ultimately through content distribution partners, again, whether that's cinema distributors or over-the-top services or broadcasters or Blu-ray, to make sure that their distribution pipelines are able to carry these video bit streams properly, and then all the way into playback. So again, whether that's a source product or the display itself, making sure that they're able to take that content, decode it, and reproduce it faithfully. So it's, there's a lot of parts to this, but ultimately that's why we like to think of Dolby Vision as being this end-to-end approach. It's really the best way to ensure that you carry that intent when the content is being created right the way through to when it's being played back, and you can only do that properly and reliably if you're working all the way throughout that process.
So how does Dolby Vision vary from the theatrical experience to the experience in the home? Because just thinking about this logically, projectors are much harder to get brightness out of than a flat panel. So could it be the case that in the home you're actually getting a better experience than you are in the theatre?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, when we look at cinema reproduction and the cinema environment, it is different. There are different considerations when we look at the cinema space. So bigger screens tends to be a very dark space. The brightness and the contrast that we can achieve, or certainly the brightness in cinema, is very different when you look at the capabilities of some modern television displays. But ultimately, what we want to do is to be able to deliver a more dynamic image. So it's not all about, as we discussed before, it's not all about the peak brightness. It's also, how you maintain and get, really nice detail in the dark parts of the image. And also in terms of color, so, that's something that we find is, people really notice this much wider color reproduction that we're able to deliver, not only in the cinema, through the Dolby Cinema proposition, but also with Dolby Vision in the consumer displays, and what that means in terms of being able to deliver a more vivid, more realistic type of image. So I think what we're doing there is making sure that we're able to deliver what we would say is the best possible image for both types of applications, both types of environment, and the approach is to do that, mainly because the type of playback technology in the environment is slightly different. Then yes, we have to have a slightly different approach in terms of the technical delivery of that in these different environments. But the end goal is the same. We want to make sure that you're getting this much more dramatic image than you're used to, with much more vivid colors, a brighter, more dynamic image. So the end goal is the same, but yes, there are these sort of slight differences in terms of how that's technically delivered.
Now, in the past, it's always been that cinema, even 35mm cinema, the experience at the cinema was different to what you got at home, because we lived in an 8-bit world where we used Rec 709 as our colour space when it came to HD video and so on, and that never matched what you would see at the cinema. But I guess what we're saying now is that the end experience, what you see at home, should be the same as what you see at the theatre if you're using the same standards and roughly the same workflow.
Exactly right. There's no reason for it to be different. The only, I would say, caveat to that is from a director's intent. So again, if for one reason or another the director wanted something to be different, well, that's a creative decision that the technology would allow. But certainly from a technology perspective, there's no reason why that should be different. We want to make sure that the overall experience is the same, that the intent is carried through. And it's one of the key reasons, or one of the key benefits, I think, of Dolby Vision versus more generic approaches to this kind of technology, that we're able to really ensure that's done reliably and consistently, time after time, and on different types of display.
You mentioned earlier that one of the key differences between Dolby Vision and generic HDR is the fact that Dolby Vision uses dynamic metadata. Can you just explain exactly how dynamic metadata works compared to static metadata?
Yeah. So with the dynamic metadata approach, what you realize is that when we look at the display capabilities today and in the future, there's a wide range of capabilities. So we've moved out of this Rec 709 kind of 100 nit world into something a lot more complicated with a lot of different approaches to being able to deliver high dynamic range. So different. I would use the term color volume. It's something we've not really gone into a lot of detail here, but to think about this in terms of the overall capabilities of a display, in terms of how many colors it can show and across what levels of brightness these colors can be rendered on the display. So you could think of the brightness as being the kind of vertical part of a color space diagram. So if we think about this as a color volume, then the color volumes of the displays are incredibly variable. So what we can do is with this dynamic metadata is, on a scene by scene basis, we can understand when this content is graded and encoded. We know exactly what's going on in that scene. We know the values of each pixel in terms of its color, its brightness. We can then use all of that information to map pixel by pixel what was intended in terms of the original image to the capabilities of that display. So that means that we're able to much more faithfully, scene by scene, reproduce the correct color, for example, which is important when you're looking at things like skin tones. So if you want to maintain, proper tone in terms of skin, then we need to make sure that we're mapping the original content to the specific capabilities of the display, because colors look different depending on the peak brightness capabilities of the display. So we need to be very careful. Now, with a generic HDR approach with static metadata, you can capture certain information about the entire piece of content, but if that content is changing, especially if it's changing quite dramatically on a scene by scene basis, then you're having to make compromises in terms of how you play that back on the display. So with a dynamic metadata approach, we're not having to make those compromises. We're able to specifically tune how that content is being played back, because we know exactly what's happening in that scene at any one time, and we know the characteristics of the display itself. So ultimately, what this means is that we're able to deliver, a really, a great high dynamic range image on a wide range of televisions with, varying color volume capabilities.
In terms of delivering the content to display, how does the intelligent display mapping engine work on a Dolby Vision enabled display?
Yeah, so within a Dolby Vision enabled display, we work with the manufacturer themselves, and what we're doing is we're taking this display mapping technology that's part of the Dolby Vision playback solution, and we're tuning it for each model of display. So we want to know things like, exactly what color space does this operate in? What are the maximum brightness or peak brightness that we're able to deliver with this display? What's the size of the display? What are the optical characteristics? Is it an OLED? Is it locally dimmed backlight? Is it globally dimmed backlight? If it's locally, how many clusters are there? All this kind of information is used by the Dolby Vision display mapping technology to properly map the incoming content to the capabilities of that display. So you can really think about it as a highly optimized, tuned mapping process that is taking all of the imaging content and all the metadata that's within that, and tailoring it to the specific imaging capabilities of that particular display.
Now, when you're discussing all that, it sounds absolutely fantastic, because basically Dolby Vision should be able to set each and every TV correctly to display the image correctly. So does that make calibrators redundant?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly when we work with the display manufacturers, because we're at a very deep level in terms of the integration of the Dolby Vision technology, then we do make it as easy as possible for the end user to get the best quality of image on that display without necessarily having to go through and do a huge amount of tuning. That said, we do work with a number of professional partners. There's a number of reasons why you might want to play around with calibrations and things like that. Maybe you're a professional reviewer, you want to actually measure the screen's performance to make sure that everything is correct. Also when you're grading, you want to make sure that you're grading in the correct way, and that the monitor is performing as you would expect. So it's not necessarily that calibration and measurement of display performance is out of the window, but when you look at a sort of generic consumer playback perspective, then yes, this coupling of this rich data that's coming in, the content, plus the Dolby Vision decoding and mapping that's tuned for the display itself, it does make it a lot simpler to get a good quality image playback.
So, saying all that, is there a dedicated calibration workflow which you have put together for Dolby Vision sets?
So that is a very good question. I would probably need to double check when it comes to consumer display. So obviously, when we're looking at the content creation workflow, so when you're using a professional reference monitor for creating it, then yes, we do have guidelines, and we work with a number of partners to deliver tools basically that allow you to make sure that everything is working correctly and calibrated correctly from the professional reference monitor. But I'd need to double check on the any specific kind of tools or any solutions from a consumer perspective.
So you've already mentioned that LG are supporting Dolby Vision on some of their displays in the UK. I guess the next question then becomes content. So where can people find Dolby Vision content?
Yeah, that is a great question. So yeah, the display side of things is looking very strong. So you mentioned LG there. So LG is a global partner. So we're very excited that LG, for their OLED and Super UHD models, globally will be supporting Dolby Vision. So that's very exciting. It is worth noting that there are other solutions. So we also work with TCL and Skyworth, and in fact in the US, manufacturer called Vizio includes Dolby Vision not only in their reference series, which was their launch vehicle for Dolby Vision, but also in their P and now their M series. So we're seeing a strong uptake in terms of the availability of playback devices, but LG certainly being an important partner for us in the UK. When it comes to content, so I think it was almost exactly a year ago now, the first Dolby Vision content became available for the cinema, so specifically for playback in Dolby cinemas. So you can watch a number of titles. Started off with Tomorrowland, and we now have other titles at The Revenant, Star Wars Force Awakens, Deadpool, more recently Jungle Book. So they can all be enjoyed in Dolby cinemas, of which we now have, there's 4 in Europe and more coming. There's 23 worldwide. If you want to get Dolby Vision in the home, then the first way of doing that is through OTT partners, so actually streaming over the internet into your Dolby Vision enabled display. So Voodoo is a partner who are out there in the US right now, but more recently, and again coupling our approach to bring this experience more globally, is Netflix. So Netflix are actually streaming now. You can access Marco Polo in Dolby Vision on Netflix. So if you have a Dolby Vision enabled LG display and Netflix, then you can start watching it now. What was very exciting, just I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, Netflix announced that they will actually be investing quite heavily in the production and distribution of Dolby Vision content. And they've said they'll be offering 150 hours of Dolby Vision content by the end of this year, which is great news. So, and yes, as well as that, we're obviously working with other OTT partners to bring Dolby Vision content over different platforms. And then something that we haven't quite touched on is obviously on ultra high definition Blu-ray. So Dolby Vision is included as an optional format for that, for ultra HD Blu-ray. We would expect the first players to be coming probably early next year, and then Dolby Vision enabled titles on that format around the same time.
One of the main questions we get asked a lot is, Dolby Vision, it's only on LG and none of the players have it at the minute, so how viable a format is it? So at the moment, with only one manufacturer in the UK and only over-the-top streaming on Netflix, your marketplace at the minute seems to be quite limited. So where can we expect things to go from here?
So I think that the important element here is that although the technology, if you like, has been really under a lot of development for a number of years, in terms of bringing this to market, it's still relatively new. So LG announced their sort of global adoption of Dolby Vision only in January at CES. So it's still relatively early days, but I think the fact that they've adopted it across a whole range of their OLED and Super UHD televisions, it's not just a niche kind of solution, sets a very good tone. And also I mentioned a few of the other manufacturers. This certainly isn't just some kind of an exclusive thing. So I think in terms of the display technology, it is quite early days, but we're really excited that LG have adopted this broadly, and these are now starting to ship. As with a lot of these things, the content is incredibly important. So we've already seen some really key major titles become available for the cinema, but as well as that, we have commitments from a huge number of studios, so from MGM, Warner Brothers, Sony, Universal, to bring Dolby Vision content to the home as well. So that's really important for us. We need to have that strong content pipeline. So with the Hollywood majors producing content not just for cinema but for home distribution, and with streaming platforms like Netflix globally and Vudu in the US, then it's giving another sort of pipeline for that content. And not only that, when we look at Netflix as an example, that original content is now being produced in Dolby Vision. So that's again, we need to make sure that content pipeline is strong, and I think it is very compelling and it's growing. But the overall thing is, yes, it is still quite early days for this type of technology. But the uptake that we're seeing and the kind of enthusiasm and excitement from the industry to get working on this now is very compelling. So I think it's positioned well to deliver this sort of experience in the future.
LG are primarily offering Dolby Vision on their new OLED range. Mm. In terms of OLED, can an OLED TV really deliver the full Dolby Vision experience given its limited brightness capabilities?
Yeah, so obviously when we look at the optics, so the actual way that the image is presented to the user, there are different approaches, and they have different techniques and different capabilities. Something that is very important from delivering the Dolby Vision experience is not just to think of high dynamic range in terms of brightness or just peak brightness, but also the contrast. So at any one time when you're watching an image, you want to be able to deliver a very sort of compelling dynamic image, but not just in the brights, also in the darker parts. And what you find, for example, with something like OLED is, you can get some, really nice highlights, very nice sort of bright images, but also some really great detail in the darker parts of the image, and also the ability to reproduce color, especially in combination with darker parts of the image is really pretty spectacular. So I think, regardless of the specifics of the display or the optics of each display, with the Dolby Vision decoder and the mapping engine that we include within that, we're able to deliver a very, very compelling and dramatic image, regardless of whether it happens to be OLED or Super UHD. It really shouldn't matter that much.
You mentioned right at the beginning that Dolby Vision uses 12-bit. Does that mean a Dolby Vision enabled display is a 12-bit panel?
No, it doesn't have to. So, the way that we've built it, a little bit like with the color space and the nits, is we want to make sure that it's capable of. So, yes, at the heart of Dolby Vision content is this 12-bit capability, but we will always want to make sure that regardless of the space that was used and the resolution that is used when the content is mastered, that it's mapped carefully and faithfully to the capabilities of, the intent of the content, but based on understanding the exact capabilities of the display.
Just to wrap things up, Stephen, you did mention Ultra HD Blu-ray. That seems to be going forward anyway in terms of quality, and I know Dolby's all about quality. It's the highest quality platform that we're going to have for HDR and 4K. So what are your plans, and where do you hope Dolby Vision will go with that format?
Yeah, so for us, it's great to have the capability of showing Dolby Vision content on Ultra HD Blu-rays. It is, as you mentioned, it is still quite early days in terms of that format. We have been working with a number of partners, and we do see a lot of excitement, and people are sort of chomping at the bit really to try and get content out there in Dolby Vision, and including on Ultra HD Blu-ray. So in terms of what's needed for that, there's a few pieces that you need to put together to bring that. So obviously the players, and we do expect the first players to be sort of later this year, early next year. So that's the first thing. We also need to make sure that the content workflows for Ultra HD Blu-ray are enabled. And just recently, Scenarist announced that they would be supporting Dolby Vision for Ultra HD Blu-ray encoding. So that's obviously an important important piece of that pie in terms of being able to bring Dolby Vision experience to Ultra HD Blu-ray. But yeah, certainly, from a technical perspective, it's there. We are expecting the first players to become available as we go into next year, and also the content pipeline is now enabled with these kind of encoding tools for Ultra HD Blu-ray.
Stephen, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a fascinating chat.
Wonderful. No, thanks very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
So our thanks to Stephen Auld from Dolby answering all the questions on Dolby Vision. I think we managed to cover quite a bit of the subject matter there, Steve. And obviously, if anybody has any questions, you can ask your questions in the podcast forum underneath this podcast, and we'll put them to Dolby. So what happens next week, Steve?
Next week it's business as usual, with the team all back for our usual selection of news, reviews and general nonsense.
And I might even have a tan, but nobody will be able to tell. Anyway,
seems unlikely considering where you're going.
So don't forget, join us next week. That's Monday the 20th of June for the normal podcast as we come back following our summer holidays. Until then, we'll see you soon.